This conference will now be recorded.
All right, we'll give it 2 more minutes. But as I was talking with Sue and Tim, for those of you who don't know, the Visitor Center is back open. We did kind of what we called a soft opening. We didn't make a ton of announcements just because we were waiting for, we wanted to make sure we had all the directions we could get from the department. But the Visitor Center will be open Wednesdays through Fridays, 9 to 4, and Saturdays and Sundays, 1 to 5. So if anybody wants to stop back in and say hello to our turtles or our snakes that they were missing, you can do so again, or any of the staff that were there. As always, the trails are open sun up to sundown every day. So, all right. We might have a few more people pop in, but I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So I am Jennifer Buheit. I'm the education coordinator at Oldham Creek National Estuarine Research Reserve. I'm sure that you are all familiar since you receive our emails, and we every day practically we get questions on kind of the history of Oldham Creek and coastal Ohio, beyond or further back than we have European settler records for. So today, hopefully, Dr. Mark Seaman and Dr. Jonathan Bowen can answer some of those questions for us. I have some prepared questions for them. You will have a chance to ask questions yourself if you have them. I'm going to give them a chance to kind of introduce themselves and let us know their background, how they're connected to, or what their connection is to the indigenous history of coastal Ohio. And then, like I said, I have some questions, and then we'll do your questions at the end. There's also a chat feature. So if you're unfamiliar with GoToMeeting, and there should be a little thought bubble in the top rightish corner. You'll see the little people icon. Right now it says 19 next to it. And then just to the right of that, there's a little thought bubble, and that is the chat feature. So if you have a question that comes up, you can throw it in there. You can type it in there, and I can ask it for you. At the end, I'll give everyone an opportunity to ask questions verbally if you would like as well. So you can come on camera and ask a question if you'd like. So whatever your preference is, you'll have a way to ask and hopefully get questions answered. Unfortunately, Dr. Bowen is having some technical issues with his camera. So if you see the little camera icon there, we won't be able to see his face today, but most important is to be able to hear his thoughts and his knowledge on the subject. So with that, I'm going to do a quick introduction. I'm going to ask that our audience members go ahead and mute themselves and turn off your webcam during the kind of main discussion portion, just that helps with bandwidth. So if we can do that.
They didn't say that it was.
All right, and then I'm going to do a quick introduction. Okay. All right. So today we have with us Dr. Mark Seaman, and he is the Professor Emeritus in the Department of Anthropology at Kent State University, and Dr. Jonathan Bowen, who is the resident archaeologist at the Pickaway County Historical Society's Clark May Museum. So Mark, I'm gonna let you introduce yourself first. Give us a little background on your personal history, and then your connection to Ohio's indigenous history. Oh, you're muted, Mark.
Oh, I'm not though. Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Seaman, and as Jennifer has said, I
taught at Kent State for many years, I think about 36. I've done a lot of archaeology in the Ohio Valley, particularly from Illinois to Indiana, Kentucky, and mostly Ohio. I don't want to be an imposter, but my focus really is as an Ohio Valley archaeologist rather than as a coastal archaeologist, but I have worked in this area on a couple of sites. I'm familiar with the archaeology, and I'm happy to be with you today. What I've done, by the way, when Jennifer sent me some questions, I put together a little mini program, sort of about five slides on a PowerPoint relating to some of these different topics. And I thought, as we proceeded, if it would be okay with you, I would give you a little presentation on these little modules, and then we would stop and discuss them and have some questions and back and forth, and then we go on to the next one. So they're kind of relating to, number one, the Indian settlement of this area as we know it from historic records. Two, a little bit about the importance of estuaries as an environment exploited by Native Americans. And three, a little bit about the site that is on, I believe, your property or immediately adjacent to it, that we call the Anderson site. So those are the kind of three modules I assembled. And after Jeb introduces himself, maybe we could start through those. What do you think, Jennifer?
Yeah, I think it sounds great. All right. Jeb, do you want to introduce yourself?
Okay, just quickly and briefly here. My name is Jeb Bowen, short for Jonathan Emerson Bowen. That's where the Jeb comes from. Anyway, I spent 17 years going through the archaeology program at the Ohio State University. And after 17 years, I finally did graduate in 1992. And I spent, during the 34 or so years I spent at the Ohio Historical Society, while we did quite a lot of work around the area from Sandusky Bay east toward the Huron River, so not too far from Old Woman Creek. And now, as Jennifer said, I'm at the Pickaway County Historical Society, so now working far away from Lake Erie. And well, thanks everybody for coming to this meeting.
Well, thank you both. As I said, we do get a lot of questions, and hopefully we can answer some of them today. And if not, we can have another one of these. I'm always happy to have throw some what we call human dimensions into our work in the science field. So I'm going to go ahead and start with our first question for our panelists. And Mark, you can you have access to share your screen whenever you'd like, so you can do that. But our first question is, what is the general timeline of Indigenous peoples living in coastal Ohio?
Well, can you guys see my PowerPoint?
No.
Okay.
At the bottom, you need to click the gray screen button.
The gray. I'm going to see if my helpmate is here that can help me with this, because I'm just not familiar enough with. Okay. Hold on one second.
No, you're fine.
Okay.
There, we can see it.
Okay, great. Great.
You want to stop?
Okay. Well, this is kind of opposite the order I was thinking about, but doesn't really matter. Let's just start here if we want to very quickly. Of course, there are a lot of details that archaeologists get into in terms of the specifics of the history or chronology of different Native American populations that lived in our area. But I'm just going to outline these for you in 5 minutes or less. We've got a screen here that shows about 12,000 years of time. That's how long we know that Indian peoples have been in Ohio, and certainly in this area as well. Beginning with what we call the Paleo-Indian period, this begins at least about 9,500 BC. This is the time when the Ice Age is still extant, about the ice mass is still about 200 miles north of Toronto, but it certainly affected our climate here. It was much colder, specifically much colder summers. There were Pleistocene animals around, and certainly throughout much of the state, caribou was the primary prey. People were highly mobile. And here's a fact that might interest you. We've got about, I think, about 11.5 million people in Ohio today. Think about in Ohio when these first colonists got here with less than 200 people. You know, it's a very different context when you put 200 people in an area this size and nobody else. It causes all kinds of problems and also presents all kinds of prospects. So that's the time of the fluted point hunters, and that's what we call the Paleo-Indian period, and it lasts until about 8,000 BC. Subsequent to that, we've got what we call the Middle and Early Archaic period. We don't really have any concerted sites of that period, but we have lots of artifacts. In other words, the sites were very small and are poorly preserved. This is a time of, again, rapid environmental change. It was wet. A lot of the species that we associate with the woodland environment, like acorns and oak and so forth, was not very well established yet. So it was primarily, again, hunting and highly mobile, very sort of transient utilization of much of the area. Beginning about 3000 BC with the late Archaic, we see much larger populations being attracted to coastal Ohio. That corresponds roughly with the stabilization of the lake shore, and we see more sedentary communities, more evidence for interaction with other populations, but still hunting and gathering as a lifestyle. But rather than focusing on hunting, the focus in terms of resources was much broader, with hunting being part of a triumvirate that also included fish and also gathered plants, various nuts and tubers and so forth. And then finally, well, not finally, but then we come to the woodland period, which is about, again, if you take a look at that, about 2,000 years long, which is still primarily hunting and gathering, but there are more settled communities, some of them in defensive positions. Particularly the early part of that woodland period, around 1000 BC to maybe 200 or 300 BC, there was intensive utilization of this area, particularly along the northerly flowing streams. We find just about every promontory that that has good elevation and is easily defensible is utilized. And then with the beginnings of maize agriculture, which is about 1000 AD, we call it the late prehistoric period. That's the period, incidentally, where the Anderson site, which is the site most proximal to Old Woman Creek, that's where that's situated in time. And that ends around 1630, at a time when much of Ohio was abandoned as a result of the Beaver Wars. The Beaver Wars were really perpetrated on the Native Americans in this area by the Iroquois, who were trying to monopolize the fur trade. They had ready access to guns and English support, and they pretty much wiped out all of the indigenous population of this area, so that the area was really abandoned for approximately 70 years when nobody was here that we can recognize. So that's the basic outline, the archaeological outline of the major periods that we have in this area. And again, there's lots more detail, but that kind of gives you an idea of the ebb and flow of the time frame. Do we want to stop and ask for questions now?
Sure. Or Jonathan, did you have anything to, or Jeb, did you have anything to add?
Mark has done the best job of anyone, and good for Mark. Mark, and I have nothing to add.
Okay. Any questions from the audience about the timeline? I don't see any. Yeah. So I did have a question. When you were saying that there were only 200 individuals here,
yeah.
What time period was that?
That's Paleo-Indian. That's the first colonists that probably came to Ohio from the west, um, the culture that we best recognize, the earliest in this area, is something we call Clovis. And Clovis seems to have originated in the high plains and spread eastward very quickly. And as you can imagine, although there were predators, namely, I think of wolves particularly as competition, ready-made competition with people for food resources, it must have been quite glorious to be in a situation where you had no other human competitors looking for meat. And I think that's one of the reasons that they spread so rapidly, is because it's kind of like kids being in a candy store in a sense, they were light on the land. They kind of cream skimmed in the sense that they kind of took the very best resources in an area and then moved on, so that in only a matter of probably 1,000 years, we have people all the way from the Midwest and Ohio all the way down into South America.
All right, very interesting. All right, our next question. What do we know specifically about the indigenous history of Old Woman Creek?
Well, I mean, you're kind of forcing me to go very specific here. The only site I know of on Old Woman Creek is the Anderson site. And I don't know how much you know about the Anderson, Jennifer. I don't know a whole lot, but I have to say that I worked at the Anderson site in 1977. That was my very first year in Ohio. And Bud Shane was the archaeologist at Kent State when I first got there. And he had a contract with the Ohio Department of Transportation to look for any archaeological resources in what we call the Route 2 corridor, which is Route 2 as we know it today. Back in the 70s, they had, I think, 3 alternative routes that they wanted to use for the new Route 2 project. And so Bud was hired to look for any archaeological materials in the way that could be salvaged or avoided. And one of the things he found in this kind of reconnaissance mode was the Anderson site. And another was something called, a site we called the Enderley site, which was on the, if you kind of think of this as a corridor, on the west bank of the Huron River, almost immediately after you go on the current bridge across Route 2. And I worked mainly at the Enderley site, which turned out to be an early Chippewa or possibly Ottawa cemetery from about 1754. And the reason we know that is because there was a piece of cloth with one of these dead individuals. And we took that cloth, which was preserved, to the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York, which was a textile museum. And they could identify that particular piece of cloth as coming from a French mill. And that particular pattern was made something like between 1848 and 1861 or something. Oh, excuse me, 1748 to 1761. So that was a very precise sort of window of placing that utilization. And it's interesting that these, although they were Native Americans, they were buried in coffins, although they had a lot of typical American Indian material with them, which suggested to me, perhaps, that they had been Christianized to some extent as early as 1750, because typically Native Americans of that period would not be buried in coffins with these hand-wrought rosehead nails. So anyhow, while I was working at the Enderley site, Bud was working at the Anderson site, which I'm not sure is actually on your property or not, but if it's not, it's very close by. And I'm going to just wheel down here a little bit. Anderson, or as we know in the archaeological world, 33E75, which means it's the 75th archaeological site recorded in Erie County, showed up. It looked like a couple it seems like there's one of these, as we would call them, Iden phase villages of this particular time period, one or two on every major drainage, starting on the Black River and going over towards Sandusky and the Portage River. Now, we only know of one on Old Woman Creek, but maybe it's because it's a slightly smaller drainage. I don't know. And these sites tend to be in defensible positions, pretty far back from the actual lake shore and the estuaries themselves. In other words, not right on the water, back in a place where there's some elevation. A lot of times these are little points of land that stick out into the drainage but are elevated with sandy soils, which are great for drainage. On these little projections, the back end can be fortified. So they're good places to live, to defend yourself and not get your feet wet. And these Iden phase sites are almost all fortified. The Anderson site was fortified. Typically, they're fortified with a ditch, an embankment, and a lot of times rows of posts, which are palisades. Sometimes the palisades aren't preserved very well because they usually didn't use extremely large wood. But picture, if you will, kind of a donut-shaped embankment with maybe 7 rows of fairly spindly, maybe 10 to 15 foot high poles around it, surrounding an area of maybe a couple of acres. These villages aren't very large. They probably would have held, I would guess, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 extended households, and I would guess 75 to 120 people each. So they're, by way of comparison with Southern Ohio, these are very small villages typically. They were occupied. Iden phase sites were typically occupied from about 1250 AD to about 1350 AD. So they're fairly late in time. People at this time were heavily involved in maize agriculture and agriculture of all sorts, you know, with beans and squash being the other 3 of the major triumvirate. And they were also fishing a great deal and hunting some mammals, but again, the mammal component of the diet was not nearly as great as what we find further south. And I'm going to show you some images of that in a little bit if you're inclined. The best known of these Iden phase sites is a site excavated by the Cleveland Museum of Natural History called the White Fort site, which is on the Black River, just right within the, or almost within the city limits of Lorain. There are 2 of these Iden phase sites in the Black River Valley, one of which is the type site, the Iden site. The ceramics from the Anderson site look like this. This is a type of pottery we call mixed or dentate. And these jars can be of various sizes. Characteristically, they would maybe hold a gallon or so of liquid, but they can be as small as a pint and as much as, I don't know, maybe 5 gallons. The vessel forms are variable, but typically they have this kind of bag-like shape, elongated, and the rims are decorated with rows of dentate stamping. And I kind of tried to show you a close-up of what that looks like over on the right. And then the bodies are sort of, there's a surface treatment that's kind of coarse cord wrap stick. Now this particular tradition, in other words, if we were to look for sites with this particular decoration on it, we would find them around 1250 to 1350 from Lorain all the way over almost to the Maumee drainage. And this archaeologists call the Sandusky tradition. And you can think of these sites as being more or less part of the same ethnic group. Call it a tribe if you want. But these people shared some common values, some common ways of making a living. And they differed to some degree with the just kind of staying with a coastal orientation around the lake as you get towards the Maumee Valley and further west going up towards Lake St. Clair. They're related populations, but this area, in other words, had its own sort of distinct ethnic group that developed along, our lakeshore from Maumee to Lorraine, that is clearly recognizable and develops as a regional tradition unto itself. I think that might be all I wanted to say about the Anderson site and related developments, but I could tell you a little bit about the housing. There are a couple, I think I have an image here. Yeah, here we go. Now, to an archaeologist, these look like rich, clear archaeological signatures, but to the average person, they probably don't look like very much. So picture in your mind's eye, on the one hand, something that looks like a wigwam that you may have been familiar with, these kind of domed, bark covered or cattail covered structures. And that would be more or less this guy up here in the upper left. That's a semi-subterranean house. It kind of looks like a keyhole, and the narrow part is an entranceway. And then the rest of what you see there is the outline of what you might think of as a basement with some scattered posts around it, not very well preserved. So this would have been a circular structure with an elongated entranceway. Look how small it is. Here's a meter scale up here. I don't know if you can see my pointer. That's only a meter, okay? So heck, this thing is only 1 meter, 2 meters, 2 meters of living space. So what is that? Maybe a little over 6 feet across in diameter. Picture a family of 4 living in a space that small. It seems almost impossible, and or you live most of the time outside. But something like a small structure like that is much easier to heat. The semi-subterranean excavation there, again, it has high insulating properties. And when we see something like this, we think of it as a winter house, someplace where somebody would have sort of hunkered down for their long winter's nap, right? And again, probably a nuclear dwelling. And then down here in the lower right is a different sort of dwelling. And picture a site like Anderson as maybe having 4 or 5 of these. These are much bigger. And so heck, this would be like 1 meter, 2 meter, 3 meter, 4 meter, 5 meter, 6 meters. Let's say 20, 25 feet long and maybe 15 to 16, 17 feet wide. This is more of what we would see as a multifamily dwelling. And each one of these little dots represents a post mold, a fairly small post. Of course, they're not all preserved. That would have been the sort of superstructure, or I should say the support structure for, again, some sort of covering. It could be bark, it could be cattails. They look like they're sort of open-ended at each end for the breeze to blow through. And these would have been multi-family dwellings for the summer months, so that you could think of maybe 3 or 4 families living together in a structure like this. So we have this dichotomy of summer and winter structures, and this is not uncommon. There are also some littler structures that were either kind of menstrual huts or possibly sweat lodges. So the constructions, again, in contrast to a lot of places, don't seem to be organized in any kind of regular way. They sort of seem to be distributed in a kind of random way within these palisades. So that's what the housing looked like. Again, I had an old friend of mine once say, the better the imagination, the better the archaeologist. And I think what he was kind of doing was sort of kidding me in a way, but also saying that, after looking at this and putting it together with ethnographic evidence, we kind of, in our mind's eye, see this as a real house, whether the layman might just see it as a series of dots, So I have to apologize for how skimpy these remains might be, but to me, they're not skimpy at all. Keep in mind they're from, the 13th century.
Exactly.
So that's, again, I have to, the burial program is generally extended burials, not too many of them in the village or sometimes in the ditches. We get an ossuary type burial that looks more like the Feast of the Dead a little bit later, but not so much with the Iden phase. Mostly stone tools, of course, and a variety of other wooden and organic tools that aren't preserved very well in this kind of environment. Storage facilities for their food, and garbage facilities to dispose of the waste. They lived, well, obviously they didn't live very peacefully because they put a lot of time in fortifying themselves. But I think if you look at what their adaptation was, they clearly lived in tremendous harmony with their environment and were well adapted to the resources of this area. And I don't know, Jennifer, I'd like to go into that a little bit more, but let's pause for some questions.
All right, and we do have questions, and then Jeb, if you have anything you want to add, let me know.
I will not hesitate.
Okay, good. All right, well, the first question in the chat is, are there any Indian sites aligned with the glacial beach ridges that step back from the lake?
Well, not in any kind of concerted pattern, that not in terms of big sites. I'm sure there are sites along the beach ridges, but I don't know of any consistent pattern where the beach ridges were a focus of Indian settlement, either at this time period or earlier in time.
Okay, all right, thank you. And the next question is, why is it called the Anderson site?
That's a good question. I have absolutely no idea. A lot of times these sites are named after the landowner. For example, I know the site that I worked here was named the Enderley site because Mr. Enderley owned the property. So I'm guessing here that the Anderson site was named after a farmer named Anderson who owned the property at the time. But that's just based on how things typically go.
Yes, that was what my understanding was, is that Anderson, that was the Anderson property.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Jennifer, I just want to say that is correct.
Okay, thanks, Tim, one of our longest running volunteers.
And while I've interrupted, can I ask a question quickly?
Yes, you may.
Absolutely.
You may have answered it and I missed it, but you mentioned Enderley seemed to be primarily probably Chippewa or Ottawa. Does Anderson have also predominantly name that we would recognize, like Wyandotte or something?
I'm going to answer that question for you a little bit later down the road in detail. But, but if you think about back to what I said a bit ago, that about 1640, everybody in this area, all the way to Illinois and all of the Iroquoian groups in Ontario were effectively eliminated as recognizable ethnic groups by the Iroquois in the 1630s and 1640s in a time period we call the Beaver Wars. With the local abandonment of this area, it's very difficult to pin a recognizable ethnicity from history onto the people who lived here. Now, having said that, I can put on my speculative hat a little bit and tell you that all of these groups along the lakeshore, even up around Cleveland, my bias, my interpretation of this, reading the tea leaves, is they were probably Algonquian speakers of some sort, Central Algonquian speakers, like the Miami, like the Potawatomi, like the Ottawa, like the Chippewa, like the Shawnee, as opposed to Iroquois speakers. And again, this is based on very flimsy evidence that we'd be going down a rabbit hole if we pursued this very far, I'm afraid. But the simple answer is no, we cannot identify a specific ethnicity to an archaeological site here that goes back to 1250. But in looking at continuities that come out of this and where these populations go, my best guess is that these are Central Algonquian peoples, or the ancestors of them, that occupied much of the upper Midwest in the 1730s, 40s, and 50s, and that we know of from historic records. Now, the other possibility is they are an Algonquian group that, in a sense, became extinct, because not every archaeological complex has to have a happy culmination in the historic period. Some of these ancestral groups simply didn't make it. You know, either they were extinguished by their neighbors, or there was some sort of pestilence and people broke up and went to live with their relatives or other friends. So that just because we can recognize a distinctive Iden phase in this area at 1250, 1350, doesn't mean their successors necessarily followed a line that led ultimately to history. You know, there are always failed efforts, right? And that's a distinct possibility as well. But it certainly wasn't a failed effort then. It was very successful.
Right. Thank you, Tim, for that question. And then we have.
Thank you. I will go back to remuting then. That was very helpful and interesting. Thank you.
We have two of the same question. So we have some early surveying maps that suggest or that have the name Old Woman Creek on the map. So our question is, what is the evidence, or do we have any evidence as to why the creek was named that, even in the earliest settlers' time?
I don't know. You know, it's just one of those particular facts of history we may never understand, right? Especially the further back they go, the more these origins of specific place names become kind of cloudy to us. So I'm sure it had to do with some specific event in the past in somebody's life, but I don't know the answer, and I was hoping you would know the answer, Jennifer.
Well, we have a couple theories, but
Yeah.
I don't think, we know the one solid answer.
The truth is elusive. Can you guys
All
see me
right.
okay? Can you see me okay, Jennifer?
Yep.
Okay, good, because I'm just seeing a chunk of me here.
I know the presenter screen can be a little disorienting, but we can see you. Yep.
Okay,
all right.
cool.
And Jonathan or Jeb, anything to add to the Old Woman Creek history?
No, ma'am, thank you.
Okay.
And Mark and I went over just last evening and, agreed what would be the best thing to present. So I've already had my input to Mark last evening, but Mark is saying so. Just
okay.
I thank Mark for his good ongoing effort here and look forward to hearing Mark's next installment here.
All right. All right. Mark, do you have one you wanna?
Well, yeah, I wanted to kind of follow up on this question of what it was like to live at Old Woman Creek, you know, and what kind of resources were utilized and how that came to be. So I've got maybe 5 images here that I'd like to present, and then we could pause and talk about that because everybody likes to talk about what they eat, right? I know coming here, I stopped at the Huron Donut Shop, and I found it very useful. Okay,
That's
well,
a classic.
to start this off, this is a diagram of world temperature, and you can see the thousands of years, and they're in thousands of years BP, which is just there just because archaeologists and geologists are curious, and rather than thinking about things in AD or BC, we tend to also think about things as BP or before present. And to make matters even stranger, and there's a reason for it, we have standardized before present as before 1950 AD. So anything that you see that says BP in geology or archaeology, you have to subtract 1950 from it to find out that age in our typical way of thinking about things. So here we are back at about the time that people entered Ohio at about, excuse me, that's wrong. Right about here is about when we first entered Ohio. You can see it's right at the heels of the warm-up period after the last glaciation. You can see the temperature is going up, 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 and right about in here is, no, excuse me, 11,000 BP. Right about in here is when the first people get to Ohio. Can you see that cursor? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you see where it is on the curve there. The temperature is probably changing worldwide more dramatically at that point than at any point subsequently. It was getting warmer very quickly. So these fluted point hunters didn't have long to hunt those caribou because they were going north or becoming locally extinct. But anyhow, what you see, and then we get it to a colder period, and then it's warming up again. This is what we call the climatic optimum between about 6,000 and 4,000 years BC, when it's at its hottest. And then you sort of see these fluctuations, and the temperature goes down a good bit, but it's going up and then going down, going up and going down. And here we see the start of the Industrial Revolution and the introduction of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And you can see that's warming us up. Well, it's hard to say at this point whether that warm up is just one of these oscillations and we're going back down again, or as climate scientists tell us, that we are in fact going to continue to go up in unanticipated ways, or unprecedented ways, I should say. I just got done reading a book on climate change. I finished it last night. And most scientists predict that within the next 100 years, we're going to see a rise in worldwide temperature of about 1.5 degrees from where we are now. So think about worldwide temperature in 100 years as being up in this area, right? I just thought that was interesting because it kind of shows how we're going into unanticipated or unprecedented areas. But what I really wanted to show was that this climatic optimum, when things are pretty warm, is precisely the time period that the lake levels begin to stabilize in Lake Erie. Before that, we've got fluctuating periods where we were getting contributions down the Detroit River from the upper Great Lakes. We weren't. There was a steep fall at Niagara Falls. There wasn't, and so forth. So I want to go from that to this slide, which is what we call the high stand watermark for Lake Erie. This occurred right during that period of maximum warmth, towards the tail end of it, about 11,500 years before present. At that point, the sea levels, we'll call it the sea levels in Lake Erie. The sea levels in Lake Erie were 10 to 13 feet higher than they are right now. So think about that for a minute. The lake is very unstable for most of the Holocene, and then beginning around 2000 or so BC, we begin to see the lake levels stabilizing at lower levels than they are here. And that's what caused these estuaries to form, cutting down through these higher deposits with different gradients. So at the same time that the estuaries are forming on the southern shore of Lake Erie, we're also getting the formation of these barrier beaches and protruding beaches like Cedar Point and Point Pelee and the like. These go together, the formation of the estuaries and the formation of these sand sprints. The reason I mention this is because prior to this time period, the kind of rich estuaries that are so productive and that are so important in American Indian utilization of this area did not exist. So the resources of Lake Erie would have been very difficult for them to tap into, because it's much easier to tap into the resources of these estuaries than it is to the open waters of the lake. In one of these estuaries, you could put in a fish weir in the spring and guarantee a nice collection of suckers, for example. But in the height of summer, with your little line and canoe out in the middle, dangling a worm for a walleye, it's just not going to be very productive. So there are no estuaries really like Old Woman Creek before relatively late in time, or about 2500 BC. I think that's a key fact. Another key fact I wanted to share with you in terms of environment and the utilization of this area is this map of about the time period of the Anderson site's occupation. And these show the major villages that we know of in the Ohio area. These ones in the south we call Fort Ancient, and these are big, with many more people per village than we find up here on the lakeshore. And over here we have a montane environment, hills and valleys, almost mountains, and we have something called Monongahela over here, where people were living on these ridge tops and farming accordingly. So these are very different environments, the Allegheny Plateau, the riverine Midwest, and the Lake Erie shoreline. And I wanted to show you what's in the middle here. You know, we've got Ohio, right? What kind of villages, what kind of serious occupation do we find in kind of the breadbasket of Ohio today? Not much, right? Not much. Everything is focused on either the coast or the Ohio River and its lower tributaries. That's, again, a very interesting thing to me. I think a lot of it has to do with the number of frost-free days. In each of these areas, you've got more than 220 frost-free days. You know, the Lake Erie has a tremendous effect on those areas immediately adjacent to it in terms of a good growing season. You don't get those kind of numbers until you get to Southern Ohio again. You also get the advantage up here of the fish and the estuaries. And down here, it's much better hunting territory. So I just point this out because of this. I wanted you to understand the patchy nature of the focus of population in our state of Ohio, and the fact that it's not ubiquitous. It's focused on particular resource sets, one of which are the estuaries like Old Woman's Creek. And finally, on this little segment, I wanted to do a comparison for you. And so what I did, I looked for the site with good preserved, well-analyzed faunal remains, that is animal bone, from that site that is most like what you would find adjacent to Old Woman Creek. And that, in my book, is someplace called the Libben site. And the Libben site sits at the mouth of the Portage River, right in what is now Port Clinton. And it sits adjacent to what was called the pond. The pond was the estuarian part of the Portage River. Okay, so it's very much like the environment we would find out outside of our window here at Old Woman Creek. And then we can compare the Libben site, one of these northern sort of occupations, with the Blaine village, which is down in Ross County on the lower Scioto drainage. And I thought it would just kind of be interesting to look, if we could, at the differences. Now, I can't get a full screen look. Let me see if I can pull this over here a little bit further. There we go. That's what I want. So let's just take a quick look, and I've got mammals, birds, and fish summarized. So let's take a look at the Libben site for a second as representative of utilization of mammals or animals in this area. Deer, heavily utilized. A minimum number of deer in this site, 35, which represents, according to the formula we use, about 3,500 pounds of usable meat, okay? A high number of raccoons. Again, these are animals that would be in all forested environments, but they do particularly well in kind of swampy areas where they can get frogs and stuff. Bears are big, just 2 of them represent a lot of meat. Elk, 1, not much. Elk, of course, is locally extinct in Ohio today. This really surprised me. Muskrat, that's a huge number of muskrats. And 80% of them show butchering marks on them. Again, muskrats aren't very big. Incidentally, as an aside, one of my uncles was a market hunter during the Depression, and he used to trap muskrats and sell them at the market as what he called marsh rabbits. So times were tough, and people were eating muskrats during the Depression, and my uncle was making out on that deal, I guess. But that's a very high number, and it speaks to the exploitation of aquatic animals. Likewise, beaver, pretty high, but the muskrat thing is really unusual. If we go down to birds, turkey, of course, we think of as the best eating bird. Comes in a relatively big package. It's tasty, quite a number of them, but ducks and geese also share a good bit of popularity here with snow geese and Canada geese, even though there's not many here, and swans, which was what you would expect. Let's look over here in Southern Ohio and see what people are eating. A lot of deer, and notice 35 deer to 39 deer. That's about the same number. But look what we find. Many more elk, a little bit more bear, hardly any raccoons, half as many beaver, a little bit of woodchuck. So it's a different kind of take down there. There's more meat on the hoof down this way, particularly as represented by these elk. but the aquatics are not represented. And down here, look at the birds. I just put the 6 most utilized species of each. Turkey, it's turkey, 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 passenger pigeon, turkey, turkey, turkey. The ducks and geese are much smaller comparatively over here. So again, it's a different resource set, as you might expect in the riverine south. Not a lot of ducks and more turkeys. This is where it really gets interesting. The fish. There's more fish weight at the Libben site than there is mammal weight. They're eating a ton of fish in this area, particularly freshwater drum, northern pike, catfish, and suckers, which are spring spawners. Just comparatively, remember they about the same number of deer here. There's hardly any fish utilization south, right? Yeah, they're eating a little bit of fish, but it's a drop in the proverbial bucket. And that's confirmed by bone chemistry in this area by my colleague Brian Redmond, who excavated a site we call the Danbury site, which is on Sandusky Bay. And he looked at the bone chemistry of human beings, of human burials. And if you eat a lot of fish, there's a chemical signature left in your bones in terms of carbon isotopes and nitrogen. And the bottom line is, if we look comparatively at people who, at their diet, these people on Sandusky Bay were eating more fish than just about any population that we could find comparatively. So it's not surprising, is it, that people who live on these estuaries are loading up on fish. It's a major part of their diet. And it's not necessarily the species that we would think of, but I think some of these were probably spring spawning species that could be exploited in the estuaries by way of nets or by way of fish weirs, so that you're not hook and line fishing, you're using some sort, or maybe an impoundment, you're getting a whole bunch at once. Again, that's another advantage of the estuary. You're getting meat in situations where it's easier to hunt or fish them than it would be out in open water. And so in the spring, but also at other seasons, this would be the type of environment you could control and work to your advantage. So I wanted to get that out there in terms of just emphasizing how Native Americans were sort of in harmony with their environment, and how if you lived on Old Woman Creek, you'd be eating a heck of a lot of fish during the year. You want to pause for some questions?
Sure. And I think that was, one of the questions we had was, why was the estuary a good place to live? And you have answered that. Sorry, one of the questions in the chat is why are perch not on the fish list?
Well, I wish I knew. I don't know much about the spawning habits of perch, but it seems to me they go for a shallow, rocky shoreline, and maybe they wouldn't be drawn to these estuaries for spawning purposes where they could be exploited en masse. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention with fish is we think of fish as spoiling quickly, so heck, if you're going to eat 340 suckers, you better shovel them down or they're going to start to not taste so good. But Native Americans smoked their fish a lot, so you would take it out and splay it and put it on a stick or over a grate and smoke it, like we think of smoked trout. And that will not allow you to preserve it infinitely, but it will certainly prolong your ability to use it over the course of literally months. So that's the one big trouble with a pulse of food like that, is you have to figure a way that you can utilize that pulse. And there are two ways. One is to hold a big feast and invite all of your friends and relatives, like a Thanksgiving dinner of suckers, or you can smoke it or preserve it in some other way, maybe make it into pemmican, although I don't know if you can do that with fish, and preserve it for a while so that you don't have to get lucky the next week, right?
Right. All right. Any other questions about this, about the food or resources found within the estuary? No.
I thought of one other thing I wanted to mention as an aside. In looking at the Libid site, at the faunal there, it's not really a food item, but I was surprised to see that the skeleton of a pine marten was found. And I don't know if you know what a pine marten is, but these are animals that are now locally extinct in Ohio. You find them up in Canada. And even though this is not like pine forest country, there were lots of pine martens and fishers in Ohio when there was dense forest, because we think of them typically as going after squirrels. But I mean, this isn't really squirrel country. And I just sort of wondered if martens also didn't eat possibly muskrats. I mean, I typically think of mink as being the primary predators on muskrats other than people. I know when we had our trap lines back when I was a teenager, we would very often get, well, not very often, but occasionally get mink in our muskrat sets. And I was just surprised to see a pine marten in, in the coastal area, in an assemblage from this area, because I don't think of them as a marsh-loving critter, but apparently it was there regardless of whether I wanted them to be there or not.
All right. And you did mention a little bit in the timeline about the crops that they were growing, but we have a question: is there any indication of vegetables that were eaten by these people?
Well, it kind of varies by time period. Late, at the time of the Anderson site, the so-called three sisters, corns, beans, and squash, the three crops that were grown intensively by Native Americans historically and that we're familiar with, those were very important. And so, maize agriculture in particular was very important at that time. Earlier, and also nuts to some degree, hickory nuts and walnuts were utilized, but the corn, beans, and squash were the biggies. Earlier in time, squash was certainly in the diet. That was cultivated in this area as early as 500 BC. Squash, of course, was not domesticated in this area, but spread here. So we find squash being utilized by a lot more early people. Corn didn't make it into this area, or beans, until relatively late in time. They were using a wide range of plants. Unfortunately, in archaeological sites, plants don't preserve very well, particularly in our climates. The only way you're going to get preserved plants or plant parts, edible plant parts, is if they're charred. So if, like a water lily tuber happened to make it into the fire, nobody ate it, it just kind of charred up like a match head, and that was put as, somebody covered it up or accidentally put it aside, and like a match head, it's going to be very fragile, but if you don't touch it, it's almost chemically inert, and that will be preserved for us to find, but that doesn't happen very often. Yeah, I can talk a little bit. So my caveat is wild plant foods are not well represented in the archaeological record, but I can sort of say, again, based on historic records and what's here, what we know would have been utilized intensively, and they would have really contributed to the diet. And here they are. Cattail, which is edible if you peel it back. It's also very usable to make mats, and also sleeping mats, and also covering for houses. Water lilies, edible tubers, and I believe edible seeds. And also American lotus, edible tubers, edible seeds. I suspect all of those are growing in Old Woman Creek today. Is that right, Jennifer?
Yep.
Have you ever pulled any up and tried to cook them?
I don't know if we've tried to cook them, but we definitely have shown the parts of the cattail and the lotus that were edible. And then there's another, did you say arrowhead? I think arrowhead has an edible tuber.
Edible. That seems to be of somewhat lesser importance historically, but yeah, that's edible. And we're leaving out the biggie as far as I'm concerned, and that is wild rice.
Right.
We know, again, from early 19th century records that every one of these river mouths, or as what some of these early pioneers, I've got an itchy nose, some of these pioneers indicated as the harbors, because if you think of these estuaries, most of them would have a Lorraine or a Vermilion or something like that on them as a sort of fledgling settlement in the early 1800s. So they would be the harbors, but they would also be the estuaries. And we get very early reports of a lot of wild rice in the shallows of the Western Basin along what is now the Michigan shore, in Sandusky Bay, a lot of wild rice, and then in the quote harbors along the southern shore, which would mean in the lower estuaries of these rivers. So wild rice is a very particular plant. It's very yummy. It's really easy to harvest from a canoe, and you don't get mud and sink down to your knees in mud to have to get that. But it's very particular about the places it grows. It only grows in areas where there's maybe between 6 inches and 3 feet of water. I've heard, but I don't know for a fact, that carp, the introduced carp, eat a lot of wild rice if they can get it. So it may be, we know waterfowl likes it, but given the number of carp that we enjoy, I suspect that the wild rice populations along the southern shore and the estuaries has decreased mightily. So I was going to ask you, Jennifer, if there's any wild rice in the basin here.
Not that I know of. Certainly not in the watershed of Oldham Creek. The only time I've seen it is we have a sister reserve way up in Lake Superior, and in their headwaters they have wild rice, and they still have part of their headwaters are ceded territories with the Ojibwe people.
Right. In Michigan and I think Minnesota, Native Americans have harvesting rights to wild rice in a lot of places. I think that's what you're kind of talking about, isn't it? Yeah. Well, you could think about reestablishing some. I don't know, what your prerogatives are there, but it would certainly be something that we could expect to find. But probably those darn carp would eat it right away anyhow. So
we do have an excessive amount of carp and goldfish swimming through our estuary. Yes,
it's always startling.
Okay.
Always startling to see goldfish swimming in Lake Erie.
Yes, I always tell people that if you find a large, and I'm talking, large goldfish, they're pretty good at life to have survived being bright orange and being that old. So Mark, I do want to respect everyone's time. So we have hit the 1 o'clock, but marker. But if there's anything else like super pertinent or like places people can go to learn more about this, if they want to research it on their free time, anything like that would be great to put in. I'd
just like to briefly use our negative time together to show you that one last slide right there. In 1701, the French established Fort Pontchartrain at Detroit. That was the first big French fort in the West. We think of Mackinac as being the earliest, but this was really the earliest, 1701. That brought a lot of tribes to it, almost as a magnet. And a lot of the groups that we find in northern Ohio recorded historically are secondary populations that have moved into Ohio after 1700 as a result of their association with Detroit. So again, when we read Ohio records of historic groups, they are relatively recent migrants, and they are here mainly secondarily because of their desire to be close to Detroit and the fur trade opportunities that presented and the protection it provided from Iroquois raiders. So I wanted to get that in.
Okay, great. So I'm going to open it up to questions. Any questions from anyone in the audience? You can turn your camera and your microphone on. You can type them in the chat. Mark and Jeb, are you? Oh, go ahead.
I was going to see if I could find my full headshot here. Can you guys see me?
Yes, we can see you.
Again, I just see a little chunk of me.
Mark and Jeb, are you okay with me sharing your contact information with folks today?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to talk with anybody who's interested in archaeology.
All right. Great. If you're on the call, I will email you that. Sue, do you have a question?
I have a comment. I would like to encourage that this topic be further discussed. I think it's a fascinating one. I actually knew these gentlemen back when they began their research because my family's property on Erie Road was bought by ODOT, and I believe the farmhouse was used to house some of the researchers at the time.
I lived in that house. It was a white house.
Well, it was sort of a green,
I thought it was white.
but across.
Yeah, I lived in that house for a better part of probably 3 months.
Well, across the street was a red house. My mother lived there, and she was always very friendly. And we had the distinct opportunity, I think it was with Jeb Bowen, to visit the Anderson site one time. And that while the research was going on, and he explained a lot about how it was done. I remember the tripod and the sifter and the fish scales, and that was really my first exposure to all of this and Old Woman Creek. And so my connections are many and varied, and I'm really pleased to have this conversation. I would also like to throw out the thought that it seems as though the national celebration of Columbus Day is beginning to morph into a recognition of Native Americans, and it might be a timely time for Old Woman Creek, maybe along with our sister reserve, also in the Great Lakes, to help the public understand these things a little more, whether on that date or just in some other way. But I just wanted to point out those two things, that I've been following your work for a long time, and I'm sorry we can't see Jeb, but hi, Jeb.
Hello, hello. Glad to see you for sure. Thank you. Yes.
You haven't seen me probably since the late 70s or early 80s when I had small children.
About 40 years.
And
It's been about 40 years.
My mother was along, but he took a lot of pictures of the progress of the road along there. We actually found a lot of arrowheads on that property, where on Erie Road over the years as well. So I know you didn't even talk about arrowheads, but this is all fascinating, and I think it's just the preamble to what more could be done as the future unfolds. So,
well, you know, one thing that comes to mind is if there are people with a lot of arrowheads, I'd be happy to come out sometime and tell you about them, tell you what they are and what time periods they're from and so forth. You just might want to think about that.
Sounds like a program for Indigenous Peoples Day.
Yes, so it is our hope to continue to offer some more programs on the historical perspectives of this area and the Indigenous people who once resided here. So yes, we hope to do more. So thank you, Sue. That's great. Any other questions or comments for our speakers before we let them continue on with their day? All right. Well, I'm not in Ohio, but I hope the weather is nice for your trip to Sandusky, Mark. Thanks you so much.
You're welcome.
And thanks, Deb, for joining and for the pre-work that you guys did.
Thank you, everybody.
Sure,
all right, and just so oh god, oh great, and there are thank yous in the chat as well. So again, thank you for your time. I will send out contact information to folks probably next week. If you have extended questions, you can contact Mark or Deb. So thank you very much and enjoy your Friday, everyone.
Thanks.
Mark, would you be able to email me your slides?
I have them on a flash drive. If Jennifer comes in, we could just keep them right on your computer.
Oh, that'd
Not
be
Jeff.
great.
Yeah,
It's Jessica. Yeah.
I need to take
I'm
my,
gonna.
I need to take my memory stick, but yeah, let's do that before I leave.
All right. Can you ask Jess? I think she's at her desk. There's probably visitors in the center, but can you just
Okay.
ask her to make a copy onto her desktop?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. That would be great. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy your day.
Thanks, you as well.
Have a good day, Jennifer. Talk to you
Thank you,
later.
Jess.